morning and welcome to the Changing Church webinar, where we talk about all the adaptive changes that congregations and their leaders are still engaging in this season of change. My name is Jim Kitchens, and I'm one of the principals of New Matrix. My colleague, Deborah, is on the call with us this morning. Deborah, always good to see you. I want to start by thanking all the other organizations who make this webinar possible. The Center for Healthy Churches, the Church Network. Phil Martin is its former CEO and now enjoying the retired life, is on with us this morning. Truett Seminary, Baptist News Global, the Presbyterian Foundation, Gardner Webb Divinity School, the Mensch Center at Belmont University, and the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving. Today's webinar is the second in our series on future forward ministries. We know that we are not at anything like a new normal yet, and yet we can't wait until whatever that is emerges before we start developing ministries that can help us lean into the future. So this series is focusing on ministers and ministries that are helping to develop ways for their congregations and the folks that they work with to lean into that future. Our speaker today is Olu Brown, who is a native of Lufkin, Texas. Olu, I wish one of our other consultants, Mike Hunter, was on with us today, because he was at First Christian in Lufkin, Texas, early in his career and loves that city. He graduated from Jarvis Christian College in Hawkins, Texas, and earned his Master of Divinity from Gammon Theological Seminary, which is part of the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. For 15 years, Olu served as the lead pastor of Impact Church, a young congregation in the East Point community of Metro Atlanta. Since its founding in 2007, he led it to grow from a core team of about 25 people to having more than 5,000 online viewers. And Impact was listed as one of the top 5 growing United Methodist churches in 2018. Olu retired from local church ministry in 2022 to start a coaching and consulting ministry around his concept of normalizing next. And that's what we're asking him to help us understand today, what that means. He calls it a practice that can help churches thrive through our current season of ongoing adaptive change. And he's the author of Normalizing Next, a post-COVID-19 resource for church leaders. I'm going to put up the URL for his website in the chat in just a moment. And I want to ask you, as you listen to Olu, if questions pop into your mind, things you want to follow up with him about, ask more about, type those questions into the chat. And as we get toward the end of the seminar, if we've got time, I'll start posing some of your questions to him. So, Olu, welcome. Glad to have you with us today. Look like you're in a bright and sunny setting this morning.
I am.
Good. Well, so how do you define your Normalizing Next philosophy, or what would you say about it to introduce us to it?
So Normalizing Next is really when churches, meaning clergy and lay, determine that they can begin preparing for the future now, in spite of the obstacles, the difficulties, or the external environment that we may be facing. That might be political, economic, social, any number of things. And essentially, we follow the text that we find in the book of Esther, where the relative Mordecai has a conversation and says, Esther, for such a time as this, you have been called. And so we are embodying the theology of our call and not putting it on hold or waiting, but saying now is the time. And the second part of Normalizing Next philosophy is, I believe we are living in the greatest evangelistic season of our lifetime, and it's right now.
All right, thanks. So there must have been some experiences you had in the time that you were leading Impact that sort of helped you shape this. Tell us about some of those experiences that gave birth to this unique approach to ministry.
So really, it's my whole life journey. So two parts of that journey. One, having a very ecumenical background. So I grew up in small town America, primarily with my mother, and we were members of two Baptist churches, and so got that experience earlier on. My father was a Presbyterian USA pastor for his entire career. And so he pastored Roseville Presbyterian in Newark, New Jersey. And then when I was a teenager, he moved to LA and pastored Westminster. So imagine 9 months out of the year, you're in small town America. And then over the summers or other breaks, you're in these huge metropolitan areas. And then when I was a teenager in Texas, the United Methodist bishop assigned a pastor to start a new church. And that was my introduction to the United Methodist Church. And then going to college at a Disciples of Christ institution. So by the time I was 21, I had this kind of ecumenical experience that didn't lock me into one tradition of Christianity, but really gave me an appreciation for it all. And I brought that into the work of ministry. And then before I got to Impact, had an opportunity to serve in different capacities, from a student pastor to an associate pastor to a volunteer pastor, and then to what we would call a senior or a lead pastor. So oftentimes when people see my experience at Impact, they think it was arriving, but no, it was this whole lifelong journey that when I came to the point of planning a church that happened to be a United Methodist Church, I and other team members really brought wealth of experience, relationships with this. So that is what has informed me as a leader, as a pastor, and over the years, what I've written about, what I've taught about, and tried to lead with.
As you were talking about, I was thinking of Brian McLaurin's Generous Orthodoxy book, where the subtitle is all the Christian faith traditions he has been a part of along the way of his journey. So really interesting to hear that you had a very similar journey. You talk in your book about sort of your own need to make a shift. I mean, that kind of preceded the church's need to make a shift. And I guess it was in connection with your leaving that church to begin this ministry. But you say when you were asked, why are you leaving? You responded, no, wait, no, the better question is, where am I going? So tell us about that shift inside yourself that launched this ministry you do now.
Yeah, recently a pastor and I were just kind of laughing and joking. He said, Olu, you left what so many pastors dream of having. And the key word is left. I believe the better word is transition. From the outside in, people assume I left something, yes, that was very great. But when I think about God's call on my life and all of our lives, it's not static. It is this evolution that we go through that often takes us to different stages along the way, as long as we remain open and continue to surrender and say yes. So for me, one part of my call that I lived was being a pastor and serving in the local church. So my next was me being able to stand up and surrender and say, look, I'm making a transition, not leaving, but I'm living into the call that God has on my life. And this next phase is being a coach and a consultant and continuing to train up leaders. Earlier this morning, I had a conversation with a business leader who I had known for some time. And this business leader looked across the table and said, Olu, thank you, essentially for living into your next. And you never know how the decisions you make, particularly the good decisions, we often hear the negative decisions, really impact people's lives. So there are so many other clergy persons and so many other lay people who are making some real decisions, not just because I lived into my next, but they're embracing this call that God has on their lives and realizing for the first time in a lot of places and spaces that God's call is not static, but it shifts and it moves, and we always have to be open and surrender to it.
Right. Well, I'll talk about this in a different context and a little bit later, but it sounds like when you were talking about surrendering and being open to the vision that God has for you, that ongoing process of discernment has been a large part of your personal journey, as well as of the journeys that you've led congregations and now other people and congregations on. So talk a little bit more about surrendering because so often we get trapped into saying, what's next for me? What's right for me? What's the next step in my ministerial career? So talk a little bit more about surrendering to the will of God in that process.
I think it's the example of Christ on the cross, not my will. In the Garden of Gethsemane, rather, not my will, but thy will be done. And not just reading that, but embodying it in our own vocational, professional, spiritual, emotional experiences. So often, and I was listening to a great podcast on change, and her thesis is we get locked into this identity. Sometimes it's a handed down identity from family and friends. It may be a career identity. And so that identity, if we're honest with ourselves, can sometimes supersede what God's Spirit is doing in our lives in any particular moment or season. So to surrender literally means I am willing to dismantle the box that I place myself in as a pastor, as a layperson, whatever your box is, and be able to be open to say, God, what are you up to? And I want to be a part of that. Unfortunately, we've experienced COVID-19, which has been extremely traumatic. But one of the outcomes of this trauma we've gone through is that some individuals have literally surrendered in ways and let down their walls in ways they never would have outside of this type of traumatic experience. And so we're seeing this across the board in every vocation, every profession. Folks are rethinking everything. And I think this is the right time to do it.
Yeah, as you said that last bit, Olu, I was thinking, well, and that's an interesting way. I mean, that almost is a way of describing the difference between technical change and adaptive change, is to say, for a long time, we kind of knew what to do next and how to do it. We knew the steps to take. And when we get to that point in the road, in the path of our journey, that we realize we hadn't got a clue. Yeah. We don't know what to do, or we've tried a lot of things and they've all failed and we don't have anything left in our bag of tricks. That becomes the moment at which you have the opportunity to say, okay, now I surrender. God, show me what it is you want me to do, what you want our church to do. I'm open to listening for the Spirit. So it can be a great thing.
One of the, and I know you probably have another question, but one of the great fortunes of this book was to develop these cohorts that have met across the country this year. And tomorrow I'll be in Chicago because we're starting a new cohort for what we call in the Methodist Church, the Northern Illinois Annual Conference. I know that may not mean much to anybody who's not a part of that denomination, but out of all the things we talk about in this book, such as fundraising or generosity and church structure and polity and theology and all of those kind of things, when we start our 6-month journey together, because that's a typical cohort, the first thing we start with is you're next. And what we try to do is demystify this reality that so many of us have had, meaning this is the only thing we can ever do and ever be. And it's nothing wrong with that. But what is God up to right now in your life? And if you're like me, a part of a denomination that has bishops who have quite a bit of authority and can move you and shift you, I think we're realizing that even in those type of polity structures, we still have ownership and we still have a direct connection with God. And what does it look like to hear God for yourself in God's direction for your life? So for so many people, this is a new way of thinking and a new way of doing life. And for some folks, it's scary.
That's a helpful word, Olu, because, and we have a variety of folks from a variety of traditions on the call, as we always do. But we sort of typically are lulled into thinking, oh man, those folks in the free church tradition, they can do whatever the heck they want. And they don't have to answer, not to answer to anybody, but it kind of goes from there all the way up to, I've always heard it said that United Methodist bishops are the most powerful ecclesiastical officers in the world. But to say, but leaning into the next, being open to what the Spirit is doing is something that can be activated no matter how hierarchical or how free church your tradition is.
Very much so.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, just tell us a little bit more about what are you stepping back and seeing in the church and the culture that leads you to make the statement that the church is in the middle of a next?
Yes. So a couple of things. I've always had a great admiration for the business world and business leaders. I think there's so many different cross connections between leaders in the church and leaders in corporations. And when I think about some of these Fortune 500 companies, and a lot of those are here in Atlanta, if you were a consultant 4 years ago and they paid you a lot of money, and at the end of that document, you said, be prepared in 2 years for a catastrophic event that will totally turn your company upside down, not only would you have been fired, but they would have communicated across corporate America, do not hire this person or this corporation. And what has happened through COVID is everything has shifted. And what I think corporations are doing more so than local churches is they're leaning into this once in a lifetime moment to be able to examine everything and ask the deep questions: what's working, what's not working, how do we need to adjust? And they're doing that because they realize this window is only one opportunity that will eventually close, and we'll never have it again in our lifetime. What churches, I believe, aren't sensing and seeing is that we have this once in a lifetime window of change moment, and we have to lean into it as leaders. But we have to be courageous leaders, from pastors to lay leaders to denominations to independent churches. We have to be courageous enough to say, this is our moment of adaptive change. This is our moment of generative change. How do we come out of this stronger, healthier, wiser, more deeply committed to the Great Commission, and start putting that work in now? I suspect you're seeing it with churches you're working with. I'm seeing with churches I'm working with, especially some of my colleagues, is they're trying to hold their own until things return to the way they used to be. But we're saying to them, things will never be the same. Let's lean into this change. So that's one of the ways I'm seeing this new normal play out in churches. And unfortunately, I don't see a lot of our local churches taking advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity.
Right. I remember a story that Deborah Wright, my colleague, told me about one of the chief executives of the Bank of America walking into a committee meeting at the church where she was pastor one day when the stock market had just really tumbled. And he said, walked into the room and said, "It's a great day to buy." But that whole sense of, yes, we're at a moment where you can yearn for the past, but to understand that past, we're never going to go back to February of 2020.
Yeah.
And to say that now it's about noticing what's dying and where those tender young shoots are, and how do you nurture the tender shoots while you continue to help people deal with the losses they're experiencing in this time of change.
Jim, I'll just give one more example very briefly, but another new normal that I believe it's important for us to normalize and help churches become more comfortable with is this idea of hybrid worship, meaning in-person and virtual. A lot of churches went virtual for the first time during COVID. And some of the questions that I get is, how long do we need to do this? How long do we need to put emphasis on the virtual? And what I tell them is this: you need to offer hybrid worship until Jesus comes back. It is no longer an option. You have to think both and. But the extension of that is not only Sunday or whenever you do your worship experiences, it's also other programs and events in the life of the church. So Vacation Bible School is now hybrid, and we plan for it to be hybrid. Sunday school, Bible studies, all of those kind of things. So it's really a new way of operating and thinking that can be taxing for some churches, but if they lean into it, they'll actually reach and see more people than they've ever seen in their church's history.
Yeah. What did it mean for impact? I'm going to guess there was a moment where your online community maybe got even bigger than the in-person community. How did that switch happen, and how did people feel about it when you hit that tipping point?
Well, ours switched at the beginning of COVID. We always had a pretty healthy online community. But of course, when you go from seeing people in person and online, but then shifting to online primarily, and you're standing on a stage or a pulpit, whatever term folks use, and you're looking at a camera and you're recording, or you're at home. Part of My sermons happen from my kitchen in the area where I live. You realize, wow, this is different. And then remember, COVID started at the beginning of 2020. And I remember the first thing people said is, okay, this isn't going to last until Easter. And guess what happened? Easter came. And when Easter hit, we said, okay, this is real. So I think the realization for me and so many other leaders in the local church was when we had to have Easter during COVID in a way we've never done it before.
Well, I'm going to toss in a question that Dave Brubaker is posing, because we're talking about, the great resignation, the great reassessment, whatever it is that's going on in pastors' minds and hearts, that's leading a number of them to decide to leave ministry, local ministry. And he's sort of saying, he's saying, how do we help those? So that's going to be a new normal. And my colleague Deborah Wright is leading a whole cohort of conversations about a new normal in terms of the new normal is part-time pastors and pastors with part-time calls. The assumption that we're going to have a full-time minister is becoming less and less an option for more of our churches. But he's sort of saying, given that that's all going on, how do we help those that are left behind in a good apocalyptic way, manage the church and when often they have heavier workloads now because some of their colleagues have left?
Yeah, and I suspect the question is around clergy persons who are left behind as opposed to the lay. Is that right?
I think it would be both.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, you can speak up and claim your own question. But
yeah, I'm a dean in a university, and we've had unusually high turnover of faculty and staff. So it's affecting multiple organizations. But congregations are particularly feeling it because they've also lost volunteers through the pandemic. Yeah. And so the workload on the remaining volunteers and clergy folks is heavier.
Great question. And that's something I saw in the local church and now working with other local church leaders. That is a consistent question around volunteers that are needed for the life of the church. But we're also seeing it at a denominational level across the board with folks who are rethinking, retiring, shifting to other careers and making other choices. A couple of things there, as we just focus on the local church, we have a window of opportunity to rethink everything. This may sound funny, but sometimes when I consult churches around worship, sometimes the question is, how do we reduce the time we're in worship? And I say, cut the fluff. So much of worship is bad programming and just fluff that you could automatically cut about 30 minutes from any worship experience. And the same is true in the way the church is programmed. There are a lot of churches that have become heavy with things even before COVID that no longer spoke to the context of their community or their vision or their why. So what I would encourage churches to do is, in a sense, to downsize. What things have we been doing that are no longer fruitful? Let's begin cutting away, streamlining, and focusing on the core of what we want to be and what we want to do. That isn't a quick solution or an easy solution, but I think it could really reprioritize the work of the clergy and the lay individuals and help the workload. We're also seeing the reality of bivocational ministry more so than it has ever been. And clergy who are in Bible school or seminaries, understanding that as they are serving local churches, it may not be a full-time appointment, and the church understanding that as well. So it's downsizing the way we do ministry. It doesn't mean doing less. Greg McCowan in his book, Essentialism, says less, but better. That's what I would offer to all churches. Secondly, looking at the bivocational track, where we're, of course, focused on the ministry that we do as clergy in the local church, but we also have another vocational experience that supplements income and the work that we do. And then the final piece of that, now this is the church planner in me, and this is just the guy who grew up in Texas where you would still have revivals outside. It's what Jim said, the bank leader said when the stock market crashed. This is a great time to get in. We are living in the greatest evangelistic season of our lifetime, where there is no aspect of the church that can't grow. if we're strategic and spiritual at the same time. So what I would offer is, on one side, we need to make some strategic cuts. And then on the other side, we need to do some strategic evangelism and reach so many people who are yet being reached by the local church.
I was thinking of Simon's Sinek's, start with why. What's the vision? It seems to me this is for all the reasons you've already mentioned, Olu, a great time to ask churches to sit with a question: what is God calling us to become? Where is God calling us? Which has both that pruning, that lopping off kind of piece to it, but also what is it that we nurture or that we haven't even thought about doing and don't know how to do, but we think that's what God's calling us to do. And so I just want, how do you, in your work, as you consult with churches, how do you help them begin to do that kind of visioning process, to surrender themselves, ask the question, what is God calling us to become, and to be willing to let go of some of those things that need to be pruned, quite frankly?
Yeah. So it sounds a little bit weird, but before I can participate in being one of their champions, I first have to participate in being one of their chaplains. Because to shift to where we're hoping churches can go and be, some things have to die. And to be honest with you, they've already died. We just need to acknowledge the death and go through the grieving process. And then as we go through that grieving process, I believe as coaches and consultants and facilitators, we're able to then help walk with them and see the new life opportunities. One of the mistakes that I've often made, in particular with existing churches that have been around for a long time, is to underestimate the level of grief a lot of those churches and church leaders experienced before COVID and now experience more so. And so my strategy at this point is not dismissing grief or loss, but walking with those churches through it, but also at the same time, pointing them and helping to point them towards new life.
Wise words, wise words. So let me ask you one more question, and then I'm going to turn to some of the questions that are in the chat. So what role do you think being willing to take risks and experimenting has in the process you're describing, Olu?
Yeah, I think it takes everything. Risks are key and important. One of the books I've been reading, there's this prayer, the Thomas Merton prayer that I pray every morning, and it comes from his book, Thoughts in Solitude. And this is a whole excerpt on, he begins it with laziness and cowardice. But I want to read the end of what he says. And he talks about risk. He says, and sooner or later, if we follow Christ, we have to risk everything in order to gain everything. We have to gamble on the invisible and risk all that we can see and taste and feel. But we know the risk is worth it because there is nothing more insecure than the transient world. And that's Thomas Merton years ago. He says, you got to risk everything. And so the courageous work that we've been called to do in this present age is to be willing to risk everything for Christ in whatever area we work in the local church or the marketplace or beyond. But as Christians, risk is something that is normal to us because the person we profess, Jesus Christ, showed us how to do it. The question is, are we willing to do it?
And as I'll sometimes say to churches, we are a resurrection people, but in order for there to be resurrection, something has to die first. And so again, and Christ has shown us what's possible when we trust God's power to raise us up again.
But dying isn't always that fun.
Yeah. I turned to a couple of questions in the chat. Dwayne Lewis asked, sort of, what are your thoughts about church mergers or church fostering as a way into this next that God's calling us into?
Well, Dwayne, I'm not as familiar. I think I understand the fostering. So if you could unpack that for me, but I'd love to speak to both.
Yeah, so Dwayne, say a little bit more about what you mean by church fostering.
Well, I think for me, just looking at church fostering from a perspective of a church coming in and helping, walking alongside of a church that's struggling, that's declining, right on the verge, of that death. So walking alongside of them, and I think that what I was looking at, man, it's like sometimes it's really hard to let go of the reins of that as a pastor, and then giving up all those pastoral rights. You know what I mean? So looking at that from that perspective, just wondering what your thoughts were about that, just kind of relinquishing your church.
Well, thank you. First, on the merger, I do believe in church mergers. I think some of the greatest churches we see in the world are the product of mergers. Knowing people who have merged churches and worked with church mergers will also reveal those can be some of the hardest negotiations to make and some of the hardest transitions to make. And the truth is, everyone doesn't merge. You always lose something in the merger, but you hope what comes out of it is greater than what you've lost individually with those two churches or multiple churches in some cases. And then as it relates to fostering, when you said that, I also thought about the word mentoring. I believe that is always a good practice to have, as long as both churches understand what that agreement is, what the relationship means, and so that all of the roles and rules and accountability structures of the relationship are clear, so that there's no miscommunication or hurt feelings or circumstances that can come down the road that can cause more issues.
Well, we've got at least one church leader on this call. So I want to ask you, what kind of church leaders do we need to be preparing for this season?
Yeah. So let me answer it by the kind we don't.
Okay.
And this is no knock on any academic institution, whether it is a seminary or a Bible college. I think every vocation and profession is facing this. I hear lawyers say often, law school didn't prepare me to have my own law practice. I'm sure doctors will say medical school didn't prepare them, to process insurance and all the things that you have to do with patients. So I think in the academic institutions that are helping to train some of our clergy, and I say that because I recognize all clergy don't come through the same processes, but for those academic institutions, this is an opportunity to rethink everything. And how not only do we train in theology, but how do we also train in other forms of practical ministry? So for instance, if you're first career and not second career, so I was first career in pastoring, there were second career pastors who had much more life skills than I had and who were much more prepared, even beyond the academic training, to lead a local church. You think about it, some pastors have never seen a budget. Some pastors have never had to raise money before. Some pastors have never had to build teams before. Some pastors have never dealt with difficult conversations before. And you place that pastor or they're hired in a family church, and they immediately have to have some difficult conversations that emotionally, psychologically, academically, spiritually, they're not prepared for. And we wonder why sometimes these situations don't work. It's because we don't always do the best job of preparing them. So first, I think our academic institutions have a role in rethinking education to supply pastors. And then secondly, I believe, and this goes back to Dwayne's question about fostering, which I would attach mentoring. I believe church leaders need to practice the humility of being willing to say, I need help, and develop relationships of fostering, mentoring, and accountability with other more senior leaders to help aid and walk them through what we know we will all experience are the difficult moments and the celebratory moments of ministry. One of the things, if I've had any success in ministry, it is because I've always embraced mentors in my life who have corrected me, who have encouraged me, and who have helped me. And so the success that we had at Impact Church as a new church plant was directly because of a larger church that I worked at for 5.5 years, where that church gave me everything from wisdom to education to training. And then I was able to bring that into a context and apply it. So those are some of the things that I would consider as we're training leaders for the church of today and tomorrow.
Thank you. Well, one last question, one that Nick Wilson put up in the chat. You were talking about how, this COVID maybe gives us a once in a lifetime opportunity to retool and to open ourselves up to God's will. But he's saying, how do you keep that? How do you stay nimble? How do you keep that, whatever you discern now, from becoming a new box that you lock yourself into? So how do you stay open?
Yeah, it's like the current new trend. Tomorrow, it's not new anymore, and that is a challenge that I believe every organization in general faces. Is how do we stay on the front line? How do we stay current? The wisdom that I have for that and would offer, and I know others would have even greater wisdom, is constantly surrounding yourself with people who are different. Whenever we're in the same of anything, we plateau and we cease to grow. It may be great fun, it may be great energy, but you're not growing. I have this group that I work out with, and they push me in my workout. And I know they push me because the next day my body is telling me, you've been pushed differently. Now, there are other people that I work out with, and we're going to laugh and we're going to joke and we're going to have great fun, but it's not going to change much on the physical side because we're all the same and we want the same thing. So I think for us in the local church, if we want to continue to be stretched and if we want to continue to grow, we actually have to do the one thing we dislike the most, and that's be around different. In our denomination, United Methodist Church, we're literally splitting, and churches are shifting and either going independent or starting new denominations. And those that are staying don't all agree. And one of the things that we're seeing is whenever we disagree, if we're not able to turn that into the energy that can help us become healthier and grow, then eventually it separates us. So the way to stay fresh, the way to grow, the way to remain relevant is to surround yourself with people who think differently, is my opinion.
One last question from me then. And you've already addressed this, but I want to give you a chance to say a little bit more about it. You talk about the importance of servant leadership for all of us in this time and moving forward. Who are a couple of the servant leaders that are really kind of those folks you look to remember what that means and to continue to move in that direction?
So from a theologian standpoint, in more modern day, and would be Henry Nouwen for me as one of those examples, just how he gave his life, not only from his writings, but how he lived his life. So he would be one of a more modern day example of a servant leader. The previous pastor that I worked for before I planted a new church, Walter Kimbrough, taught me so much about leadership and being a pastor by demonstrating it. And so he has also been one of those servant leader examples for me. And then when I think about all of the lay people that I've interacted with, women and men who did not ever sense a call to pulpit ministry or be a clergy person, but were some of the greatest preachers that I've ever met, not so much by what they said, but how they lived their lives. And so I've had a great fortune of always being around and impacted by servant leaders, women and men from all walks of life. But those are just a few.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Olu, I want to thank you for a really wonderful conversation this morning. I want to remind folks that if you want to see all of Olu's publications, you want to learn more about his coaching and consulting services that he'd be glad to offer you and your judicatory or your church, that olubrown.com is the website, and lots of good stuff about Olu there. Olu, I want to thank you for giving your time to us this morning, and really, I learned a lot out of this conversation today. Let me say a little bit about next Thursday. We'll have our last webinar for November. We're not going to try to meet on Thanksgiving Day. Probably have family members that would be mad at us if we did. But next Thursday, our presenter will be Kenda Creasy Dean, who's a United Methodist pastor, and the Mary Sonnet, and I probably said that wrong, professor of youth, church, and culture at Princeton Theological Seminary. And she's going to be talking about her most recent book, Innovating for Love, Joining God's Expedition Through Christian Social Innovation. She'll unpack that long title for us then. So we hope to see you next Thursday. Thanks for joining us today, and have a good week.